the man known to history as Andrew Jackson had finally achieved the impossible. In the winter of 1828, the gates of the White House swung open for the hero of the frontier. But as the nation cheered for its new president, a silent tragedy was unfolding in the shadows. His beloved wife, Rachel, would never see the glory of the inauguration. She was dead just days before the celebration began. Was it the weight of the crown, or a curse born of a brutal campaign? How does a man rebuild a nation while his heart is being buried in the Tennessee soil? Nashville, 1788. It wasn't a city of lights and music. It was a fragile outpost of log cabins huddling together against the vast, dark wilderness of the Cumberland River. This was the far edge of the American frontier, a place where the reach of the law was short, but the memory of a man's honor was long. Here, civilization was a thin veneer, and survival was the only currency that truly mattered. Into this volatile, mud-caked world stepped a young man who looked as though he had been carved out of the very hickory wood he would one day be named after. Andrew Jackson was just 21 years old, thin, intense, and carrying a jagged scar on his forehead, a permanent souvenir of a British officer's saber and his own refusal to kneel. He had come west from North Carolina to seek his fortune as a public prosecutor, bringing with him a restless energy and a temperament that was already legendary for its explosive fire. Seeking a place to stay in this crowded settlement, Jackson found himself at the home of the widow Donaldson. The Donaldsons were frontier royalty, one of the founding families who had survived a harrowing 1,000-mile journey by water to settle this land. Their boarding house was the social heart of Nashville, a rare oasis of warmth and conversation in a world of constant threat and backbreaking labor. But there was a distinct tension hanging over the hearth. Living there was the widow's daughter, Rachel Donaldson Robards. She was vivacious, dark-haired, and possessed a spirited laugh that seemed to defy the darkness of the woods. She was also, in the eyes of both the church and the state, a woman already bound to another man. Jackson was a man of quick impulses and profound loyalties. When he looked at Rachel, he didn't just see a beautiful woman. He saw a kindred spirit, someone who shared his fierce independence and his refusal to be broken by the world's cruelty. The attraction was immediate, magnetic, and profoundly dangerous. In the small, claustrophobic environment of a frontier boarding house, every glance was scrutinized, and every silence was heavy with unspoken meaning. Rachel's husband, Louis Robards, was a man consumed by a toxic, volatile jealousy. He was a figure of fits and rages, a man who saw threats in every shadow and rivals in every passing guest. He treated Rachel less like a partner and more like a piece of property that he was perpetually on the verge of losing to the wilderness, or to the stranger who had just arrived at their table. Nashville in the late 1780s was a society where reputation was everything. To be a lawyer and a public official meant Jackson had to navigate a minefield of social etiquette in a place where people were quick to reach for a pistol. He was living under the same roof as the woman he was increasingly drawn to, while her husband's suspicion turned the atmosphere into a powder keg. The log walls of the Donaldson home were thick with the constant simmering threat of violence. Every time Jackson sat at the dinner table, he was conscious of Robards' watchful eyes. Every time Rachel spoke, she was conscious of her husband's quickening temper. This wasn't just a blossoming romance. It was a slow-motion collision with a rigid social code that did not forgive. and certainly did not forget. The American frontier offered freedom from the kings of Europe, but it imposed its own brutal standards. Jackson, the orphan who had survived the horrors of the Revolution, was now entering a different kind of war, a war for his own heart and his own standing in a community that valued honor above life itself. He was a man who had never backed down from a fight, and as the summer of 1788 bled into autumn, the tension in the Donaldson house reached a breaking point. The stranger had found a home, but he had also found a conflict that would define the rest of his life. A love story was beginning in the whispers of a Nashville boarding house, one that would eventually lead to the highest office in the land, but not before it left a trail of scandal, broken vows, and blood. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the frontier was waiting to see who would be the first to blink. By the autumn of 1788, the boarding house of the widow Donaldson had become less of a sanctuary and more of a psychological battlefield. Andrew Jackson, the young prosecutor with a reputation for uncompromising steel, found himself entangled in a drama that the law books had not prepared him for. Louis Robards, Rachel's husband, was no longer merely suspicious. He was a man unhinged by a perceived loss of control. The air in Nashville was thick with the scent of a scandal waiting to ignite. Robards, in a fit of characteristic rage and wounded pride, eventually packed his belongings and retreated back to Kentucky. For a brief moment, the tension broke, but on the frontier, a husband's departure did not equate to a woman's freedom. It merely shifted the nature of the danger. In the winter of 1789, a rumor reached Nashville that Robards was planning to return to claim his wife, by force if necessary. Jackson, acting as the self-appointed protector of Rachel's honor, made a decision that was as romantic as it was reckless. He would escort Rachel nearly 2,000 miles down the Cumberland and Mississippi rivers to the Spanish-controlled territory of Natchez. In the eyes of the frontier, this was a mission of chivalry. In the eyes of the law, it was an elopement that bordered on abduction. They traveled through lands where the trees were the only witnesses, moving toward a horizon that promised a life away from Robards' shadow. In the lush, humid atmosphere of Natchez, far from the rigid social structures of the North, the two felt a sense of liberation they had never known. And here is where the fatal mistake occurs, a twist of irony that would haunt Jackson's political career until his dying day. News arrived in Natchez that Louis Robards had successfully petitioned the Virginia legislature for a divorce. To a young man of action like Jackson, petitioned meant finalized. He was a lawyer, a man whose entire profession was built on the precision of language and the finality of a judge's gavel. Yet, in the heat of his passion for Rachel, he failed to perform the most basic due diligence. He did not ask for a decree. He did not wait for a signature. He took a rumor of a law as the law itself. Believing Rachel was a free woman, Jackson married her in the summer of 1791. It was a union born of a deep, genuine affection, a rare match of spirits on the American frontier. But the legal reality was a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Louis Robards had not, in fact, completed the divorce. He had only obtained the permission to sue for divorce in a court of law, a process he did not actually finish until 1793. For 2 long years, the future president of the United States was living in an illegal marriage. To the world, Rachel Jackson was not a pioneer wife. She was a bigamist. And Andrew Jackson, the man of the law, was an adulterer. This mistake reveals a profound contradiction in Jackson's character. How could a man who spent his days prosecuting others for minor infractions be so catastrophically negligent regarding his own household? The answer lies in the culture of the American frontier. In places like Nashville and Natchez, the higher law of honor often superseded the written law of the statutes. Jackson believed that because he was protecting Rachel from a cruel husband, his actions were inherently moral. Regardless of what a piece of paper in Virginia said, he saw himself as the hero of a frontier epic, rescuing a damsel from a villain. But the American political landscape was beginning to change. The wild frontier was being replaced by a nation of laws, and Jackson's enemies were already beginning to take notes. In the 18th century, the boundary between being a heroic protector and a wife-stealer was razor-thin. By marrying Rachel before the ink was dry on her divorce, Jackson had crossed that line. He had handed his future opponents a weapon of mass destruction, a stain on Rachel's character that would eventually be dragged through the mud of the most brutal election in American history. The man who refused to bow to a British officer had finally met a foe he couldn't fight with a saber, the cold, unyielding reality of a legal timeline. He had won the woman he loved, but he had planted a seed of tragedy that would bloom exactly when he reached the pinnacle of his power. The lawyer had won the heart, but he had lost the case, and the price of that victory would be paid in tears and blood decades later. The illusion of peace lasted for 2 long years. Between 1791 and 1793, Andrew Jackson and Rachel lived as husband and wife in the eyes of the Nashville community. They built a home. They established a life. To the world, they were a frontier success story, a rising legal mind, and a daughter of a founding family. But in the shadows of the law, a ticking time bomb was waiting to explode. And the man holding the fuse was Louis Robards. In late 1793, the news reached Nashville like a thunderclap in a clear sky. The divorce was finally over, but not in the way Jackson had assumed. The legal documents from the Mercer County Court in Kentucky revealed a horrifying truth. Robards had waited. He hadn't finalized the divorce in 1791 when he was given permission. Instead, he waited until Rachel was living openly with Jackson. Why? Because by waiting, he could sue for divorce on the specific grounds of adultery. In the cold, unyielding language of the court, Rachel was officially branded. She was accused of deserting her husband and living in a state of adultery with another man, Andrew Jackson. The shock was absolute. Imagine Jackson, the man who prided himself on his mastery of the law, realizing he had walked right into a trap set by a man he despised. He had been living in a state of bigamy. Rachel, a woman of deep faith and impeccable social standing, was now a public adulteress in the records of the state. The humiliation was a weight that would never fully lift. In the rigid, puritanical social structure of late 18th century America, a woman's reputation was her only currency. To lose it was to become a social leper. Divorce was not just a legal ending, it was a moral catastrophe. At that time, across the entire state of South Carolina, not a single divorce was granted between the Revolution and the Civil War. In Virginia, it required a literal act of the legislature. For Rachel, the verdict was a life sentence of shame. The timing was calculated cruelty. Robards had allowed them to build a life just so he could tear it down with maximum impact. On the 27th of September, 1793, The jury in Kentucky found Rachel guilty of the charges. The marriage was dissolved, but the damage was done. The architect of his own destiny had failed to read the fine print of his own life. Jackson's negligence had turned the woman he loved into a target for every gossip and political rival for the next 40 years. The man who had faced British sabers and frontier ambushes was now helpless against a piece of paper. Jackson did the only thing he could to mend the breach. In January 1794, in a quiet, solemn ceremony in Nashville, Andrew and Rachel married for the second time. This time, the papers were signed. This time, the ink was dry. This time, there was no doubt in the eyes of the law. But the frontier does not forget. And the political elite of the East certainly do not forgive. What Jackson saw as a private mistake, fixed by a public vow, his enemies saw as a permanent stain. They didn't see a husband protecting a wife. They saw a wife-stealer and a bigamist. This moment changed Andrew Jackson. The jagged scar on his forehead was now matched by a scar on his public character. He became even more volatile, even more protective, and even more ready to kill anyone who dared to whisper Rachel's name with anything less than total respect. He realized that in the game of power, the truth is often less important than the perception. He had won the legal battle to be her husband, but he had lost the war for her reputation. The tragedy of the White House didn't begin in 1828. It began here, in a small courthouse in Kentucky, where a husband's revenge was codified into history. The man of the law had been outlawed, and the boy who refused to kneel to a king would now spend the rest of his life fighting to clear the name of the woman he loved. The fuse had been lit, and the explosion would eventually rock the very foundation of American democracy. May 30th, 1806. The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon in Logan County, Kentucky. For Andrew Jackson, this wasn't just a political disagreement or a business dispute. This was personal. This was about the only thing that had survived the fires of his youth, the honor of his wife, Rachel. Charles Dickinson, a wealthy lawyer and a legendary marksman, had done the one thing a man in the West could never do and expect to live. He had called Rachel Jackson an adulteress. He had dragged the private shame of that old bigamy scandal into the public square. And in the world of the frontier, where the law was a whisper and the pistol was a roar, there was only one way to settle the debt. Jackson was 21 when he met her, but at 39, he was ready to die for her. Dickinson was widely considered the best shot in Tennessee. He had killed multiple men in duels and was known for his ability to hit a coin tossed in the air. Jackson knew the odds. If they both drew at the same time, Jackson would be dead before his hammer even dropped. So, Jackson did something that defied all military logic. He decided to let Dickinson shoot first. He calculated that his own will was stronger than Dickinson's aim. He would take a bullet to the chest just to ensure his own hand was steady for the return fire. He wore an oversized, loose-fitting coat to disguise his thin, wiry frame, hoping to trick Dickinson's eye into missing his vital organs. It was a gamble with eternity. They stood 24 feet apart. The morning air was cold, the silence heavy. The word was given. Fire! Dickinson was a blur of movement. His pistol barked. A puff of dust flew from the left side of Jackson's coat. Jackson's hand went to his chest. He felt the searing heat of the lead. The bullet had shattered 2 ribs and lodged itself just inches from his heart. Blood began to soak through his shirt, pooling in his boots. Dickinson, stunned to see his opponent still standing, stepped back from the line in terror. "Great God!" he cried. "Have I missed him?" Jackson didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He stood like a statue carved from Tennessee hickory. His teeth were clenched so hard they nearly shattered. Through the blinding pain and the internal spray of blood, he raised his pistol. He took his time. He looked Dickinson in the eye, the man who had slandered his wife, and pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer had stopped at half-cock. According to the brutal rules of the Code Duello, he had to recock and fire again. The silence in that clearing was absolute. You could hear the wind in the trees and the heavy, ragged breath of a dying man who refused to die. Jackson pulled the hammer back once more. He aimed again. Boom! The ball caught Dickinson in the groin, tearing through his body. The marksman fell. He would be dead by sunset. Jackson walked off the field under his own power, hiding his agony until he reached his horse. It was only when his doctors saw his boots overflowing with blood that they realized how close he had come to the end. When asked how he stayed standing after taking a direct hit to the chest, Jackson's answer was chillingly simple. "I should have hit him," he said, "if he had shot me through the brain." This was the emergence of the man of the West, a figure who solved every problem with a blend of terrifying violence and an unbreakable will. He had silenced Dickinson, but he hadn't silenced the scandal. In fact, the killing of a popular man like Dickinson turned many in Nashville against him. They saw him as a cold-blooded executioner. Jackson didn't care. He carried that bullet in his chest for the next 39 years. It was a permanent, leaden reminder of the cost of Rachel's honor. Every time he took a deep breath, he felt the sting of her reputation. The duel was over, but the war for the White House was just beginning, and Andrew Jackson had just proven that he was willing to bleed for every inch of the way. He had traded a piece of his lung for a piece of his pride, and in the brutal logic of the frontier, that was a bargain he was happy to make. The man of the law had become a man of blood, and the path to the presidency was now stained with the color of his own defiance. The world now knew. You could break his body, you could pierce his heart, but you could never, ever make Andrew Jackson blink. Beyond the smoke of the dueling grounds and the noise of Nashville's courtrooms, there was a place of relative silence, the Hermitage. This was Andrew Jackson's sanctuary, a sprawling southern estate where the white pillars of the mansion stood in stark contrast to the deep red Tennessee clay. For the man who would soon be known as Old Hickory, this was the only place where he could finally lower his guard. But inside the walls of this grand house, there was a quiet, lingering sorrow that no amount of political success could erase. Despite their profound, unbreakable devotion to one another, Andrew and Rachel Jackson were never able to have biological children of their own. In an era where a man's legacy was measured by the sons he left behind to carry his name, this was a void that the law and the sword could not fill. But the Jacksons did not live in a house of silence. Their home was perpetually filled with the laughter and chaos of children from their vast extended family. In 1809, they legally adopted one of Rachel's nephews, naming him Andrew Jackson Jr. To Jackson, this was far more than a legal formality or a social obligation. It was a chance to be the father he had never known. He doted on the boy with a surprising tenderness, perhaps hoping to shield him from the cold orphan reality that had defined his own traumatic youth in the Waxhaws. He wanted a legacy built on love as much as it was built on power. But the most striking example of Jackson's complex, often contradictory humanity was yet to come, and it would arrive from the heart of a bloody war zone. In 1813, during the brutal Creek War, Jackson led his troops into the smoking aftermath of the Battle of Tallushatchee. Among the wreckage and the dead, his soldiers discovered a tiny Creek infant, orphaned and crying in his dead mother's arms. When the surviving women of the tribe were asked to care for the boy, they refused, saying that since his entire family was gone, it was better to let him perish where he lay. Jackson, the man who was currently and systematically breaking the power of the Creek Nation, looked at the baby and saw his own reflection. He saw the 14-year-old boy standing alone in the ruins of the revolution. He refused to let the child die. He personally fed the infant with a mixture of water and brown sugar, and then he sent the baby, whom he named Lincoln, nearly 200 miles back to Nashville. He sent him to Rachel with a simple, profound request. "He is a child of the woods," Jackson wrote, "and I want him raised as our own." This is the central paradox of the man. The warrior, who is feared for his ruthless efficiency on the battlefield, was the same man who sat at his hearth in Tennessee with a Native American son on his knee. At the Hermitage, the warrior was replaced by the planter. He took immense pride in his thoroughbred horses, the yield of his cotton fields, and the intricate domestic details of his estate. He was a man of the southern soil, a figure who believed that a man's home was his fortress and his family was his sacred trust. To see him in the gardens of the Hermitage, walking softly beside Rachel and checking on the children, was to see a version of Andrew Jackson that his political enemies in Washington could never truly comprehend. Life at the Hermitage was a fragile, beautiful equilibrium. It was a world of warm hearths, adopted sons, and the quiet companionship of the woman who had survived the scandals and the sabers by his side. But the peace of the frontier plantation was never meant to last. The world outside was beginning to roar his name, and the man of the West would soon be called to a stage far larger than the Tennessee backwoods. Jackson had finally found the family he had lost as a boy, but he was about to lose the peace he had worked so hard to build. The quiet of the Hermitage was merely the eye of a hurricane. A storm was gathering that would sweep him toward a destiny he had never sought, and a loss from which he would never truly recover. The hero was ready to become a legend, but the man was about to pay the ultimate price. The election of 1828 was not merely a contest for the presidency. It was a descent into the abyss of American politics. It was the moment when the gentleman's game of the East Coast elite collided with the raw, uncompromising energy of the Western frontier. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans and the man known as Old Hickory, was no longer just a general. He was a movement. But as his popularity surged among the common people, his opponents in the camp of John Quincy Adams realized that they could not defeat him on the battlefield of policy or military record. So, they turned their sights toward the one place where Jackson was most vulnerable. They went for his home. They went for Rachel. In the early 19th century, the American press was beginning to discover a terrifying new power: the ability to weaponize a person's private past to achieve a public end. This was the birth of what we might call dark PR, a prototype of modern character assassination where the goal was not to argue, but to erase. The Adams faction unleashed a flood of pamphlets and newspaper articles that dragged the 30-year-old scandal of the Natchez marriage back into the light of the midday sun. They didn't just call it a mistake, they called it a crime. They branded Rachel Jackson a convicted adulteress and a bigamist. One particularly vicious editorial asked the American public, ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband to be placed in the highest offices of this free and Christian land? To understand the sheer cruelty of this attack, you have to understand who Rachel Jackson had become. She was not a political figure. She was a deeply religious, private woman who sought only the peace of the hermitage. She was a woman who spent her days in prayer and her evenings caring for her adopted sons. To the elite of Washington and Philadelphia, she was a backwoods woman, unrefined and morally stained. They used her as a proxy to attack Jackson's fitness for office, suggesting that if a man could not manage the morality of his own household, he could not be trusted with the morality of a nation. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to destroy a woman's soul to win a man's vote. Jackson was consumed by a protective rage that was almost biblical in its intensity. He was a man who had survived the revolution and survived a bullet to the chest to defend her name. He had fought duels and shed blood for her honor. But here, in the election of 1828, he was facing an enemy he couldn't meet on a field in Kentucky. He was fighting against 1,000 printing presses. He was fighting against whispers in every parlor from Boston to Charleston. He wrote to his friends, desperate to shield Rachel from the news, but in the hyper-connected world of a national campaign, the walls of the Hermitage were no longer thick enough to keep out the poison. The breaking point arrived in the autumn of 1828. While in Nashville preparing for her move to the White House, Rachel discovered a pamphlet that detailed the accusations against her in brutal graphic detail. She read the words adulteress and wife-stealer attached to the man she loved more than life itself. The shock was physical. She collapsed. Her heart, already weakened by the stresses of frontier life and the constant anxiety of Jackson's military career, began to fail. She had survived the wilderness, she had survived the jealousy of Louis Robards, but she could not survive the organized hatred of a political machine. As the election results came in, it was a landslide. Andrew Jackson had won. The man of the West had conquered the swamp. But as the bonfires of victory were lit across the country, the lights were fading in the Hermitage. Rachel Jackson was confined to her bed, her spirit broken by the weight of the campaign. She looked at the glory of the presidency and saw only a crown of thorns. The victory was hers, but the price was her life. Jackson had finally achieved the pinnacle of power, but the woman who had stood by his side through every shadow was slipping away just as the sun was rising on his greatest achievement. The dark PR had worked. They couldn't stop Jackson from becoming president, but they had ensured that he would walk into the White House as a man completely and utterly alone. The tragedy of the White House was no longer a possibility. It was a looming, inescapable reality. December 1828. Nashville was a city in the midst of a thunderous celebration. Andrew Jackson, the man who had been broken and rebuilt by the American frontier, had finally claimed the highest office in the land. The man of the West had defeated the Eastern establishment in a landslide victory that felt like a second revolution. But inside the walls of the Hermitage, the music of victory was replaced by a deafening, hollow silence. For Rachel Jackson, The cost of the White House had become a weight her heart could no longer bear. The years of public humiliation, the relentless attacks on her character, and the branding of her name as an adulteress had finally taken their toll. Her spirit had been battered by the most vicious campaign in American history. And as the winter solstice approached, her body simply gave way. On the night of December 22nd, 1828, just days before she was set to depart for Washington, D.C. as the First Lady of the United States, Rachel Jackson suffered a massive heart attack. She collapsed in the arms of her husband, the man for whom she had sacrificed her peace and her reputation. The scene inside the bedroom was one of absolute, unshielded horror. Andrew Jackson, the iron-willed general who had stared down British bayonets and lead bullets, was completely undone. He refused to believe that the woman who was his soul's only anchor was truly gone. He ordered his servants to place her on a table and keep the room warm, convinced that she was merely in a deep faint and would wake at any moment. For hours he sat by her side, holding her hand, waiting for a breath that would never come. He was a man who had conquered every enemy on the field, yet he stood powerless against the silence of death. The funeral took place on Christmas Eve. It was a gray, somber day that felt like an ending rather than a beginning. Thousands of people from across Tennessee gathered at the Hermitage to pay their respects to the woman they had known as a kind, pious neighbor, not the monster the Eastern newspapers had described. Jackson, dressed in deep black, stood by the grave like a statue carved from Tennessee hickory. His eyes, usually filled with a piercing, restless fire, were now clouded with a grief that bordered on madness. He had lost his parents and his brothers to the First Revolution. Now, the Second Revolution had taken his wife. As the earth was lowered onto the casket, the nature of his upcoming presidency underwent a fundamental, permanent shift. It was at the graveside that Jackson uttered the words that would define the next 8 years of American history. Looking at the faces of the friends and family gathered there, he spoke with a voice that was both shattered and chillingly steady. "May God Almighty forgive her murderers," he whispered, his eyes narrowing with a terrifying focus. "As for me, I never can." In Jackson's mind, the political elite in Washington, the men like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, who had allowed the attacks on Rachel to flourish, were not just political rivals. They were assassins. He did not see a democratic opposition. He saw a cabal of men who had systematically murdered the only person he had ever truly loved. The election had not ended the war. It had only made it personal. When Jackson finally began his journey to the Capitol in early 1829, he was a different man than the one who had celebrated the victory in November. He traveled in a black carriage, a widower in mourning, carrying Rachel's miniature portrait close to his heart. The rowdy, chaotic inauguration that followed, the famous Reign of King Mob, where the common people stormed the White House, was a stark contrast to the hollowed-out man at the center of it. Jackson walked into the executive mansion not as a triumphant hero, but as a man seeking a cold, calculated justice. The tragedy of the White House had cast a long, dark shadow over the American experiment. Every veto he would sign, every enemy he would crush, and every institution he would tear down was fueled by the memory of that Christmas Eve in Nashville. The right hand was now a hand of vengeance, and the nation was about to discover what happens when a man with nothing left to lose is given absolute power. The era of Jacksonian democracy had begun, but it was a democracy born of blood, tears, and a vow that would never be broken. Andrew Jackson didn't enter the White House as a triumphant victor. He entered as a man in mourning. The presidency, the highest honor a nation could bestow, felt like a hollow prize without the woman who had shared his scars and his struggles. But while Rachel was gone, the murderers he had sworn to never forgive were still there, lurking in the parlors and ballrooms of Washington. It didn't take long for the war for Rachel's honor to find a new battlefield. It came in the form of a social scandal that would nearly paralyze the American government, the Petticoat Affair. Peggy Eaton, the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, was being systematically shunned by the respectable society of Washington. The wives of the cabinet members, led by the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, refused to socialize with her, whispering that she was a woman of loose morals and a common flirt. To the political elite, it was a matter of social etiquette. To Andrew Jackson, it was a terrifying, vivid repeat of history. He saw Peggy Eaton being dragged through the same mud that had eventually buried Rachel. He didn't see a cabinet dispute. He saw an assassination of character. Jackson chose to defend Peggy Eaton with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. This was his chance to pay a debt he could never settle with the dead. He told his cabinet, "I will not have a lady of my family, or any lady associated with my administration, treated with disrespect." When they refused to bend, Jackson did the unthinkable. He dissolved his own cabinet. He fired his friends. He severed ties with his own vice president, Calhoun, a move that would eventually fuel the fires of Southern secession. He was willing to burn the pillars of his own government to the ground just to protect the reputation of one woman. The man of the West was no longer ruling with a pen or a constitution. He was ruling with a heart that was perpetually bleeding and a spirit that remained permanently on the dueling grounds. This was the legacy of the man known as Old Hickory. He was a figure of absolute contradictions, a Democrat who ruled like a king, a lawyer who defied the Supreme Court, and a husband who governed a superpower based on the whispers of a Tennessee graveyard. His presidency was defined by a ruthless protective fire that sought to crush anyone who dared to challenge his sense of loyalty. He had won the White House, but he had lost the only peace he ever truly wanted. On the 8th of June, 1845, the iron will finally gave way. Andrew Jackson died at his beloved estate, the Hermitage. He didn't ask for a monument in the Capitol or a grand tomb in the halls of power. He was buried in the garden, in a simple grave right beside Rachel. He had spent 30 years with a bullet in his chest and a scar on his forehead. But the heaviest weight he ever carried was the miniature portrait of his wife he wore around his neck until the very end. As he was lowered into the Tennessee soil, the era of the frontier hero came to a close. Andrew Jackson had outlived his brothers, his parents, and his enemies. He had reshaped a nation in his own volatile image, proving that in the American story, a man can rise from nothing to absolute power, but he can never truly escape the shadows of the heart. The stranger had finally come home, and for the first time in 40 years, the war was over. He had kept his vow. He had never forgiven, and he had never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share to support me. See you in the next video. Have a good day.